All right. So last week we talked about uh, organizing and keeping your apothecary. This week I want to talk about keeping track of what you do for people, keeping record of some sort. So not necessarily the most glamorous aspect necessarily of working with people, and in some cases you may not need to do that if you're only working with a few people, or if you're only working with close friends and family and so forth. You might not feel like it's necessary, although it can still be helpful too. It can still be helpful to keep some track of what you've done, because maybe somebody will ask you to do it again. And if you don't know what you did, then that makes it a lot harder. Um, but before I get into all that, I just want to take a moment to talk about what's going on in the natural world right now. And of course, we all spent some time out in the woods recently. And that was a good look at what was going on out there. Here in town, the most noticeable thing that's changed since last week is that a lot of trees are starting to come into pollen and starting to come into more full bloom. The Bradford pears are sort of finishing up their bloom, but some of the other rose family trees, the apple trees and things, are starting to open up, and maple trees and some kinds of oak trees are starting to bloom, starting to come into pollen. So some of those will be wind pollinated. Lots of red maple, lots of white oak type oak trees are starting to come into bloom now. So that's a change. And of course, dandelions and violets are continuing to increase in how many of them there are in bloom right now. So they haven't peaked yet, especially violets haven't gotten anywhere near their peak yet. Spring beauties are kind of in full bloom all over town. So in any place that they grow, there will be a lot of them. Same with red dead nettle. There are tons of red dead nettle flowers blooming that you can see. But yeah, dandelions are still on the increase, and violets are really just kind of getting started. And violets will come to a big full bloom sometime in April, around the middle of April, and then they will go down to a lower level of blooming throughout the year until after the first frost. So they don't all bloom at once, but they do a whole lot of blooming in the early spring, and then decreased amount of blooming after that. So that's good stuff to keep in touch with and be aware of in the area around you. And there will be more and more stuff changing as the spring moves along. And of course, out in the woods, you've got the trout lilies and the trilliums and all those wonderful things in bloom. So soon the trees will leaf out and it will get darker on the forest floor, and there will be a different set of plants blooming and coming up from the ground also. So yeah, record keeping is, like I said, not necessarily the most glamorous part of being an herbalist or working with people with plant medicines, but it can be really helpful. Now, if you're doing it in a clinical type of situation, you want to keep really detailed notes that say when people came in, and all the things that you asked them and their answers to all the questions you asked them and stuff like that. If you're doing it on a more informal basis, you might not need all of that, but it can still be good to have a notebook that you just use for this, that you write down what you did, what was going on with somebody, what your assessment was of the situation and why, and maybe what you did for them. And that can be very simple sometimes. Somebody was having their spring allergies that they have every year, and you made them something for it, like maybe some thyme and mullein, or some jewelweed and mullein, or something like that. Jewelweed and goldenrod. And that way, if they say, oh, what you gave me last time was really helpful, then you'll know what that was. And you'll also be able to look back and see, what strategies you might have used that might have been successful. Because, I think it's always important, if you want to be good at working with plant medicine, to not just be thinking about this plant for that symptom, but to also have strategies of what you're trying to get to change in the body, and how you're trying to get that change to happen through plants. So that's something that you might be able to look back on the development of as you learn more, and also something you might be able to learn from what was successful and what was not, as far as different therapeutic approaches go. I wanted to read something to you here. This is a case book that is written in Latin. I don't think that it's very visible, but written in Latin in the 1650s. This is in the late 1650s at the time that this is happening. This is a really fascinating document for me. This was one of my ancestors, several generations back. His real name was Eamon O'Mara. In Latin, he used the name Edmundo de Mera, and in English, he used the name Edmund O'Mara. But really, his name was Eamon. So he used Irish and English and Latin, but he wrote in Latin mostly. Irish was his native language. English was a language that he used for dealing with English people, which a lot of people in Ireland at the time were. And he also lived in England for a few years. And then, of course, Latin was something that he wrote in so that people all over Europe would be able to read it. And this particular case is called Ab auris ulceri gustatus deperditus. So, sense of taste lost due to an ulcer on the ear. To translate what he's saying from Latin to English, I won't read the Latin out loud, but he says, around the time of returning to Bristol, that's the city in England that he was living in, but he had gone to London for a while. Around the time of returning to Bristol, I found a certain woman relieved of an abscess on her left ear, yet still deprived of the sense of taste completely. Let's see. Effusion, I guess, I conjecture, was poured from the ulcer on the ear, from the ear, into the third nerve pair, which are the authors of taste, through a branch of the conjugation of the fifth nerve pair, where it comes near the third pair at the articulation of the jaws. So if you're familiar with anatomy, people number the cranial nerves. He's using a different numbering system. The numbering system that we're used to is doesn't come along for over 100 years after he wrote this. So what he's calling the third nerve pair, I believe we would call the seventh, and then the fifth is still the fifth, but he seems to be going from the other direction. Anyway, so what's happened here is an infection on the ear has affected, he believes, the nerves to the tongue, preventing someone from having a sense of taste. And the one reason I think that this is interesting is because we're seeing loss of taste as a result or an after effect of infection pretty often these days with COVID. I haven't seen it as much this year as I've seen it in the last couple years, but so I think it was more of a thing with earlier variants, but definitely still happens for some people, definitely is still ongoing for some people. But the presence of infection close to the nerves that affect it, so in the whole ear, nose, and throat area, you have a lot of basically a shared surface. So the surface of the inside of the ears connects to the surface of the throat, and the surface of the throat also connects to the surface of the nose. So this is all one continuous area of epithelial tissue, of moist tissue that bacteria, viruses, and so forth can enter through. This person had an ulcer on the outside of their ear, but he believes that it's the toxins or waste products from the infection are coming in contact with the ear, and that's why the person has lost their sense of taste. So it's still, kind of a relevant clinical presentation. And this is something you could see now. It's not unheard of for someone to have an external ear infection and lose their sense of taste from it. Although it seems from the way he's writing this that it doesn't seem to be a familiar scenario in his experience or in his, something that he's read about or anything. He says, her treatment was effected, or cure was effected through the use of discutients. Discutients are medicines that help break up congestion or clots or stagnation of any sort. So through discutients, through smudging, and through injecting medicine through a syringe into the inside of the ear. So he doesn't really tell us what medicines he uses. He just tells us about what the strategy was. Using smudging, which is like heating with smoke, using discutients, presumably internally, and then also squirting stuff into the ear through a syringe. The next sentence doesn't quite make sense to me. It says, there's no mention about this of the tongue in topics. Topica. Topics or Topica is a book by Aristotle, in which Aristotle, in that book and in other places as well, talks about the senses and whether taste is a form of touch because you have to touch something with your tongue to be able to taste it, or whether it should be considered a separate taste. But he says there's no mention of this about the tongue in topics, which I consider to be someone else's fault. I'm not exactly sure. I think he's kind of making a joke that I don't quite get there. I know that later on, his son published a translation of that work of Aristotle's. So it might sort of be an inside joke in terms of that, although this was a published case. So lots of people all over Europe read it. And, probably all of those people had read Aristotle more than I have, because it was just a bigger part of the educational curriculum back in the 1600s. So this is something that was almost 400 years ago, 370 some years ago, that this case was written down. So I can still, just from the fact that he took the few minutes to write these couple of paragraphs, I can kind of tell what he encountered. First of all, what the case was, the sort of thing that he encountered. We don't really know what caused the ulcer on this person's ear. He didn't either. It was gone by the time he saw her, but he knew that she had it from taking a history. And then what the after effect, the loss of taste, and sort of a general strategy of what he was doing, using dispersing herbs, using herbs for stagnation. If you remember way back, we talked about stagnation as being one of the main forms of dysfunction in the human body. So he's using herbs and things for stagnation, herbs and heat, smoke, and all of that for stagnation and for cleansing the area. So that's his general strategy. He doesn't talk about what specific herbs he uses. I wish that he did, but he hardly ever talks about that. He almost always talks about the strategy and just kind of assumes that you have herbs that you use, or you have medicines that you use for these functions, but he's not telling you which ones he's using. So maybe that's more like a trade secret or something. I'm not sure exactly what the thinking was there. But anyway, that's an example of an informally written up case that gives us some information with, like I said, some clinical relevance today. There's still people, I have talked to people this week who have a loss of taste, not from an ulcer on their ear, but from an infection in their ear, nose, and throat area, in their head area, that was not directly affecting their mouth, but indirectly affected their sense of taste and also their sense of smell most of the time. So that's, something that human bodies are fairly consistent throughout time, at least very consistent throughout the time that we have any written records of. And so something like that is often still relevant. And what this person's original infection was is kind of up for anybody's guess. It could have been a staph infection on the skin. It could have been tuberculosis, which sometimes causes sores on the skin. It could have been a spider bite that got infected. It could have been all kinds of things, and we don't really know about that. But we do at least have the conjecture that waste products from the infection were affecting the nerve. And so, yeah, it's kind of nice to be able to look back on something like that and see what somebody else did for a similar topic, if something like that comes up. And that's really how the practice, the overall practice of healing has grown, is by people sharing that kind of information. Pretty significantly, when you get back before the 1600s, case write-ups get real thin on the ground. You don't find very many of them compared to what you find later on. Around this generation or the generation before it is when people really started keeping case books, writing things down, teaching at least their apprentices and students about what they learned, sometimes publishing papers that were more widely read, explaining what they had learned. And when people started doing that, there was a huge leap forward in the collective understanding of how the human body works and how the human body responds to different types of treatments. Before this, people were still kind of going by things like the aphorisms of Hippocrates. And the aphorisms of Hippocrates were written 2,400 years ago, so almost 2,000 years before, or a little over 2,000 years before this case was written up. But they were still being taught in med schools at the time that this guy went to school, and they were very much just kind of like little proverbs, not even anything so in depth as what I just read here, but most of the time just little sayings or proverbs or facts, some of which weren't really facts, but things like, when a finger or an ear is cut off, it can't grow back. Or so that's a pretty obvious one that's correct. There's also some of them that aren't necessarily correct, like Hippocrates says women are never ambidextrous, and that's not really true. I mean, that's most people are not truly ambidextrous, and almost everybody is able to do some things with both hands, but women are not necessarily less likely to be ambidextrous than men. So it's just kind of maybe a reflection of a bias, or something that someone heard and passed along that wasn't necessarily correct, but became sort of received wisdom for many, many generations. So there were a lot of things like that in medieval times, because there was not a lot of new stuff being written about medicine. Some, but a very small volume of it in any given generation. And when people really started more consistently keeping records and sharing their discoveries with each other, and making their things that they found out available to their colleagues, that was really helpful. And so being able to keep track of what you're doing is helpful for that. You don't want to share the specific details of an identifiable case with anyone ever, but it is good to be able to, I mean, with very limited exceptions, it is good to be able to keep track of what sorts of things you've done and what sorts of results you've had. So the way that they would do that in the 1600s was by having a special notebook that they wrote stuff down in. And a lot of the times these were very informally organized. They were chronological and not necessarily topical or anything like that. So it would be, something like, April 1st, I saw this in this person, and this is what was going on with them. And then there might be another mention of that same person a month later. And, they're not like connected. You just kind of have to go through the whole thing and find it. And it's okay to keep records like that if you don't have a lot of people that you're working with. If you have 1,000 different people or even 100 different people that you're seeing on any kind of a regular basis, then that's going to kind of be a nightmare to try and go back and find what you were doing before. Sometimes you'll remember it. Sometimes you'll be surprised by it. I had somebody come to the old clinic who I had seen something like 10 or 12 years previously. And he said, "Can you make me more of what you made me for my stomach last time?" And I knew exactly what it was that I'd made him for his stomach last time, even though I hadn't seen him or talked to him in the time in between. I just happened to remember it. And that's great when it happens, but it can't really be counted on. So sometimes it's really helpful to have specific records. And with tablets, computers, things like this is easier than it used to be. We used to use filing cabinets, have a file with somebody's name on it. You go find that file with that person's name on it, and then you open it up and you've got their case and everything that you've ever done with that person. And that's one way to do it. And that's a fairly decent way to do it. If you have it in an electronic form, then it's a little more portable. It's a little more easy to add to, easy to pull up, things like that. It's also, in some ways, more durable, although, mischance can happen to electronic records as well, or people can lose access to them, things like that. But I had an incident in 2003 where I lost all my records. There was a flood and everything got flooded, inundated with mud, completely, destroyed, rendered illegible, moldy, everything like that. So it was very disruptive. It was very disruptive because I didn't have any more physical record of what I had done with anybody. Whereas if I had had that, not that there were tablets at that time, there were tablets, but they were like stone tablets. There weren't any, electronic tablets at the time. But if I'd had it in the form that I have it now, I would have one copy on the device itself and another copy saved remotely and, inaccessible to anybody except me. So if I lost my password, then that would be bad too. So there's always the possibility for mischance of that sort, but it's a little easier to make copies with electronic things than it is with stuff that's written out in pen on paper, the way I used to do it. Sometimes I still write things out on pen and paper, and then I take a picture of it and turn it into a PDF. That's easy too. So we live in a very advantaged time as far as record keeping and the production and processing of information goes. And I say that that's, a great thing for anybody to be able to make use of. But at a minimum, you want to have something where you write down the stuff, even if you're just working with your family, family and friends or whatever. You want to have a notebook that you write things down on that is somewhere where nobody else but you is ever going to see it, unless you know you have reason to show it to them, because sometimes people might tell you really personal things, and even though you're not a covered entity under HIPAA or anything like that, those laws don't technically apply to you. You don't. It's still not ethical to reveal anything you found out in the course of being a healer to anybody that is not, the person affected or someone that they have specifically assigned to you to be able to reveal that information to. So, having some security about it, having it somewhere that's, maybe in a drawer with a lock or something like that can be a good idea. But having the information written down in some form is really indispensable, because it will stay written down. And this book that I have here, like I said, it was published. He wrote it down and then he took that to his publisher and they published it. But there weren't that many copies of it made, I don't think. It was, fairly widely distributed, but not that many people read books and bought books back in those days. They were pretty expensive. So I actually got the facsimile that I have here from the Bodleian Library at Oxford University through interlibrary loan. And I was able to, this is back in the days of microfiche, where you have a little reel that you turn and it moves the microscopic film through the projector until you find the page you're looking for, and then you pull a little lever and it makes a Xerox copy of it. So that's how I got this. Now it would probably be a lot easier and I wouldn't have to wait weeks for a little film microfiche to get mailed over from England to UK, to the University of Kentucky. So it's much easier to get a hold of information now, and much easier to move information around even than it was in the 1990s. So that's something. But yeah, I think in general, just like it's good to concentrate your material that you use in the form of having an apothecary where everything is all together, it's good to be able to concentrate what you're learning as you go along through your cases and things like that, by just having a case book where you have notes on specific people that you've worked with. And I know when we talked about assessment, I talked about this as well, but there's some basic information that you should always be getting from people, including what the symptoms are that they're experiencing right now, what their health history is like, including medications they might be taking, allergies they might have, past experiences of any serious illnesses or injuries, lifestyle factors that might come into play, like whether they're physically active, whether they have any sort of a job that's high risk for certain types of things, like if they're doing a lot of heavy lifting, that's going to be harder on their back, for instance. So you want to have that kind of information. In with what you're writing about them, and then what their presenting symptoms are, what structures and functions you believe to be involved, and that's your analysis of things, what structures and functions are involved, and what is your strategy for bringing balance to them, and then what specifically you used in terms of medicine. And then hopefully you get a chance to follow up with them and find out how it worked. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes people come to you and ask you for a remedy, and then you don't see or hear from them again for a long time. But ideally, it's good to be able to say, let me call you and check in with you in a couple days, or come back and see me in a week, or do this for 3 months and then we'll see how things are at that point, or something like that. And that way you know how well something you're doing is working, instead of just assuming that it's working or assuming that it isn't or anything like that. You just want to be able to gather that information and incorporate that information into your understanding of the situation. So yeah, one very basic option is having a notebook that you keep somewhere secure that is that you're writing stuff down in. If you're working with more than a few people, more than say a dozen or so people, it might really be good to have a file drawer or a filing cabinet or something like that where you keep physical files, or something on a device where you keep virtual files. And that's what I mostly do now, is have things on a device where I keep files virtually, because it's convenient and it's secure and it's easily managed in a variety of different ways. You know, you can easily put make copies of it or send it to the person or something like that. It's also really nice to be able to just, like, if somebody's got a rash or a lesion of some sort, a sore, something like that, you can take a picture of that and put it right in the file, in the document, and just paste it right in there, and then that will be there. And that's so convenient compared to how difficult that would have been even 20 years ago, something like that. You don't have to mess with cameras and film and everything, printing stuff out. Just take a picture with the device and put that picture in the document, and then you can compare it to next time and make sure that the thing is healing, or whatever the situation is. So I really I encourage everybody to use that technology that's available. I think it's really wonderful, and I don't think it's at all at odds with the Stone Age practice of going to the woods and gathering your medicine, and making your own remedies out of medicines that you gathered from fields and forests. I think that it's really good to be able to blend those ancient traditions with modern conveniences where they're appropriate and not destructive. And I think that that's a good example of something that is that. There is, potentially concerns for security if you're storing something on a third-party site or anything like that. And I think that that is something to be aware of, not to assume that just because something is, just because you're accessing it through your device doesn't necessarily mean that no one else can access it either. But in a lot of cases, I think there is pretty decent security for documents out there, and lots of people store more sensitive information than this in some electronic form or other. But it is important that you are thinking about people's privacy and trying to do what you can to reasonably safeguard that against any kind of intrusion. So yeah, the main reason that I think it's a good idea to keep records like that is to be able to better serve the person that you're trying to help, be able to, be better at improving someone's health. There are secondary reasons, like being able to share that information with someone that you're teaching later, that, I saw someone and this is what I did and this is how it worked, generally without identifying the person, but just in general terms of being able to look back on what you've used in a situation and know that something went well or didn't go well. It's very helpful for that. being able to share that type of information once you've gathered it, once you've collected it and analyzed it, being able to share that type of stuff that you've learned from the cases, not the details of the cases specifically necessarily, but the information that you've learned from the cases, being able to share that with colleagues is a really good thing to do that helps to move the whole practice of plant medicine in the world forward. But I think that the primary reason should always be for the benefit of the person who has come to you for help. And so that's the main reason I think that it's important to do this is for the benefit of those people, so that you can offer better quality of care to people who have asked you for your help. And it really can make a huge difference to be able to know exactly what you did before. So the more detail that you're keeping, the more likely you are to avoid any sort of mistakes and be able to, with a greater degree of fidelity, achieve reproducible results, achieve success consistently, instead of, happening upon it sometimes, but missing out on it at other times. So it really does make you a better herbalist, and it also makes that specific case more manageable, and it makes the herbal community better herbalists as a whole as well. Because you'd be surprised, there are actually quite a few things out there that get passed on as sort of, like I said about Hippocrates stuff, received wisdom, that aren't necessarily true, that maybe some popular teacher would put out there and that other people would repeat because they heard it from this popular teacher. But then when you get into actual clinical practice or actual, practical use of it, sometimes it doesn't bear out. A really good example of this would be, in my opinion, the combination of echinacea and golden seal. I'm not exactly sure who started popularizing it. I haven't thought of who it might have been, but I don't want to say because I haven't really gotten a chance to fully research the story. But somebody back in the 80s or so started popularizing the combination of echinacea and golden seal as though it were basically an antibiotic, like the herbal penicillin or something like that. Even though penicillin works pretty differently than either of those plants, echinacea works by stimulating the immune system. A lot of people don't really quite know what that means because the immune system is kind of mysterious, but generally speaking, it makes the cells that carry out immune functions more active. And then golden seal is antibacterial, especially with bacteria that it comes in contact with. And then beyond that, it's also drying. But if you had, for instance, an infection that was under the surface of the skin, but not in the digestive system or the urinary tract or anything like that, maybe just like an infection under your skin in your arm, something like that, golden seal is really not going to be able to get to that. So taking golden seal orally isn't going to directly affect it. So in that way, it's pretty different than an antibiotic that gets into your bloodstream and goes throughout your system and kills bacteria that your bloodstream comes in contact with. So anyway, for many years, every herb company out there had their echinacea golden seal blend. And a lot of people really just kind of recommended it for everything, regardless of whether they were viruses or whether they were bacteria. Anything that seemed like an infection got the echinacea golden seal treatment. Or at least that was what, if you went to a health food store, that's what a lot of times would get recommended. It was, recommended by various different herb books at the time, things like that. But it really was never that effective. And I when I first heard about it, I was like, well, that doesn't really seem like what I use those herbs for. But I was open to the possibility. But then I started talking to a lot of people who would come to me and say, I've got this situation going on. I've already taken echinacea and golden seal, and that didn't work. What else might I do for the situation? And so through that sort of keeping of that sort of information, keeping track of that sort of information, I was able to pretty conclusively convince myself that that it was not acting the way that people were expecting it to act. And I think that, nowadays, a lot of other herbal teachers have said the same thing, that it doesn't really work that way. It's not really what people were trying to market it as, or doesn't really fit into the category that people were trying to shoehorn it into, of being a one-size-fits-all anti-infective remedy. And there are a lot of good remedies out there for infection in various different forms and so forth. And golden seal can be one of them in some situations, but it was being vastly over applied, and also applied kind of on the assumption that it wouldn't affect gut bacteria, which it absolutely can if you take enough of it. And you can definitely get the same sorts of diarrhea and stuff like that from taking too much golden seal that you can get from taking large doses of conventional antibiotics. So it was a situation where information had gotten passed around that was not really based on clinical experience, and became popular very quickly, I think, and then took quite a while for actual experience saying this doesn't seem to be working, to convince people that it wasn't necessarily the usual, wasn't necessarily what it was widely being assumed to be in terms of its effectiveness. So, having records, keeping track of what's going on really helps you to see patterns like that, really helps you to find out, helps you to separate real stuff from conjecture, because there's plenty of both things out there. And, helps you to figure out for yourself what seems to be working, which is, not always going to be consistent. Not everybody is going to agree with it all the time. You might have some people who say, oh, I tried this particular combination of plants and it worked great for this particular combination of circumstances. And other people might say, I tried it and it didn't work that well for me. So there's always some of that. And keeping records allows you to figure out what works in your situation, because, for one thing, not every batch of licorice out there has exactly the same medicinal potency and is going to have the same effects in practical terms. So it could be that certain things work well in certain climates, it could be work well in certain types of people, could be that they work well with certain subtypes of bacteria, for instance. So, there are all sorts of different things that come into play there, but it allows you to gather information, because you can't really analyze information that you haven't gathered. You can't really you can't transmute data into knowledge unless you gather the data first. And so keeping records really helps you to do that. It helps you to gather this raw information, which you can then turn into knowledge and experience and understanding. And so it is kind of, sometimes it feels like a chore, you want to, the fun part is when somebody comes to you and you know what to do and they get better and everybody feels great about that outcome. And that's the fun part. And, writing down what you did is not necessarily the fun part, but it does make you better. It does enhance your powers as an herbalist over the course of time if you are engaged in that practice. So I strongly recommend that exercise, that practice, to everybody, of just every time you work with somebody, even if it's just, your own kid with a stomach ache or something like that, write it down, what you did, and what you know about the situation. And that way you'll have that to add to, draw from, compare with, and so forth later on. Any questions about that process? Or there is good charting software out there that's made specifically for that, but a lot of it is really geared towards billing insurance companies and stuff like that. So a lot of it isn't necessarily what you would want as an herbalist. But most of the time I just use something like a word processing with a template that I've made up that has fields for entering different parts of the information. And like I said, pasting in objects like photos or whatever is an option now too, and that's really helpful. All right, I will be back in just a moment.
What about like soap notes types things? Could you use that?
You can use that kind of a format. Yeah. Yes. Sometimes it might not have exactly like what you would yeah, I mean, you can basically fit things into that kind of a format. That's what massage therapists use. I'm not as used to doing it that way, but if that were, something that you were used to or familiar with, that would be a perfectly reasonable way to organize the information, especially as long as you know what information you're looking for and where to find it and so forth. Wanted to talk about a couple of specific herbs. And the first one I want to talk about is an herb called Pedicularis canadensis. I grew up calling this plant wood betony. And then after I was fully grown and had been doing herbal medicine for maybe 2 years or so, I found out that there was another plant called wood betony that had been called wood betony for longer and was kind of more the official wood betony. And the plant that I called wood betony, some other people call lousewort. I didn't really like the name lousewort. So now I usually just call it pedicularis, which is not much better than lousewort. But anyway, this is a plant that grows in our woods here. This is starting to come up now. Here, I'll write this out in the chat. Pedicularis. So that is, yeah, it's starting to come up right now. When the leaves first start growing, they are sort of a purplish red color, and they're in a basal rosette. And as they grow, they turn dark green, and then they send up a stem. And at the top of the stem, there's a whirl of tube-like yellow flowers, yellow and reddish flowers sometimes. So it's a very distinctive looking plant. And I really like this plant for the effects that it has on the nervous system. Pedicularis is calming to the nervous system, and it's relaxing, calms and relaxes people, relaxes their muscles. which we have a lot of herbs that do, skullcap and motherwort and passion flower and so forth. Pedicularis also kind of calms the nerves in a different way that's not as sedating. In a way, it's sort of similar to what Bacopa does, where it just helps people to be in a calmer mood without being tired. And in particular, I find that pedicularis is helpful for keeping people from getting overwhelmed and overstimulated. So it's really useful for people who have a tendency to get overstimulated or overwhelmed, or have sensory integration issues where maybe, certain types of sounds or certain types of sights or whatever are kind of setting them off, putting them in a bad mood, maybe triggering migraines, maybe triggering meltdowns, things like that. So I use it for a lot of people who have sort of differently structured nervous systems that have a hard time navigating social situations. So if people are having tendency towards meltdowns or towards a lot of distraction and inability to focus, executive dysfunction type stuff, it can be really helpful for that. It's only a little bit sedating in terms of, like, it doesn't make people so drowsy the way that, not even as much as chamomile does. So if you take it in a small dose, that effect is pretty mild, but it does make them a little less stiff and a little more able to integrate sensory experiences without getting bothered or triggered by them so much. So that's an herb that I use often, almost always, along with other herbs like nettle and bacopa, that I think of as being nourishing to the nervous system. And, in that situation, I would also, if someone were having sensory integration issues, for instance, where they're getting overwhelmed when they're in noisy places, or maybe they'll, start feeling confused or highly agitated if they're around a lot of noise or a lot of bright lights, or a situation like a store where there's a lot of different things that are designed to catch your attention. Pedicularis can be helpful for that. Usually for those people, there's a whole lot of things that I want to do before I start putting any sort of medicinal herbs into them, like trying to find out if they're getting adequate high quality fats in their diet, and finding out if they have any food sensitivities, which I don't always do that before I start giving them herbs, because sometimes that takes a long time to figure out, because you have to take something out of the diet and then put it back in and see if you notice a change. But it's really helpful for that type of situation, although it usually needs the help of sometimes dietary interventions, good sleep, things like that, that are sort of very foundational to the nervous system functioning correctly. So, it's not something I think of as being a treatment in isolation, but it is often really helpful along with other things, for those types of situations. Externally, it also kills fleas and lice, bed bugs. You can put it in a little muslin bag or a sock or something like that when you're washing clothes, and wash the clothes with it, and it will sort of inundate the clothes with a little bit of the smell of the herb, and that is insect repellent. And also, a wash made from it is good if somebody has a lot of scalp itching or skin itching, is good for helping to calm the itching itself, which is kind of like another form of a sensory integration dysfunction, when you have a type of inflammation on your skin that's itchiness that makes you want to scratch at it, which then furthers the itchiness. It's kind of like, basically like a short circuit or a glitch, or something in your nervous system's programming that's not working the way that you would want it to. But it's helpful for that topically. And it's also kind of calming to the nervous system internally in a way that would help with that as well. What does it smell like? It doesn't have a very strong smell. It smells planty. I don't even know. It doesn't smell like aromatic. It's a little bit aromatic. I don't know how to describe smells very well. It's sort of, I don't have the vocabulary for smells like I would have for colors. But it's not real perfumey or floral or anything like that. It doesn't smell like it has a lot of essential oils in it. But it has a little bit of something like that in it. But yeah, it kind of smells like green and leafy type stuff, but it does seem to have enough of a smell to it that it repels insects, or maybe it just hides you from them. Do I have a picture of it? I do not have a picture of it. I can see if I can find. Sorry, I'm trying to find a decent picture of it, but that is what that looks like. So it's pretty unusual looking. It doesn't really look it. The shape of the flowers looks a little bit like a mint flower, but not exactly. And the color on this particular species has a combination of yellow and reddish or brownish color. There are also some purple ones. Sometimes there's a white variety of the same species as well. So yeah. Somebody asks if this is something I have used for adults on the autism spectrum. Yes, adults and children. Um, uh, and like, it's really not directly affecting the autism itself. It's affecting the sensory integration issues that some people in that situation and some other people have. But it is, useful for that type of situation. And it is also just kind of calming in general. It is something that is not necessarily like with chamomile, if you took too much of it, it wouldn't really cause any problems. Usually it would just make people drowsy. If people get too much of pedicularis, they get confused. So it can make people feel like a little bit drugged if they get a whole lot of it. But it's not, so it's not like it's a pretty well tolerated herb. It's not something you have to use in really low doses, but it is something where you do have to kind of keep an eye on, is this dose doing what you want it to do? Because there is a possibility of it making people feel weird and that sort of thing, which is not what you're going for with it. So yeah, it's not as perfectly well tolerated as some of the stuff that we've talked about, but pretty well tolerated, generally speaking. So I think that it's a good herb to know about, and a good thing to be looking out for if you happen to be in woods in Kentucky, especially in the eastern quarter or so of the state, third or so of the state. It's pretty common there, lot less common here, but it is a woodland plant. It's not so much a thing that you would find in fields and meadows and things like that. It tends to grow in the woods. There's a question here. Hang on a second. Would it help with headaches that are brought on from sensory issues for autistic kids? Yeah, it does. Because it is a muscle relaxer. And, if you can get it to the person before they're exposed to the overwhelming sensory situation, then it's more helpful. Once the headache has started, you probably need something that's either going to be a little stronger for the muscle relaxing, or more pain relieving or something like that, depending on how it's presenting. Sometimes with that sort of situation, the best thing to do is give somebody something that's going to help them sleep and let them take a nap for 30 minutes to 2 hours, and then they'll feel better. That sometimes that will disrupt people's schedules or whatever, but if you can, sometimes that's the only thing that helps if a headache is pretty bad in that type of situation. But yeah, it does definitely help to kind of forestall that sort of thing coming on. And it's, I use it a lot in autistic people, but I use it in other people too. So it's a good herb in general to know about for the nervous system. And it just allows you to calm the nervous system in a slightly different way than you would with Bacopa or with skullcap or something like that. So they're not all, or valerian for that matter, they're all different approaches to settling and soothing and protecting the nervous system. And have various different degrees of subtlety. And pedicularis is stronger than some things, but less drowsying than some other things. So less drowsying than most of the herbs that I think of as being nervy and sedatives or things for sleep. So another question is, would it combine well with pain relieving herbs like meadowsweet? Yeah, it and meadowsweet aren't going to get in each other's way at all. So meadowsweet is more of a purely anti-inflammatory and circulatory type of herb. And so it's working on the inflammatory system and the circulatory system, and pedicularis is working on messaging in the nervous system. So it's pretty reasonable and good to take both of those together. Not something I've ever seen any kind of problem from. Just a moment, I'll be right back. Now, so the next herb that I want to talk about is Elysium, also known as star anise. I just like to call it Elysium, its Latin name, rather than star anise, because the name star anise makes it sound like it's a type of anise, which it is not. But culinarily, it's similar to anise because it has a similar smell and flavor to it. So that's why it got that name, because of its use as a spice and a flavoring, but nothing to do with its actual botanical makeup. Star anise. I will. Oh well, yeah. Let's see. Elysium is. Oh, I kind of hate this. It has an I and then two L's and then another I, which the I and the two L's all kind of look the same when they're typed out. Elysium. Illiccium. So this is what it looks like. And this is why it's called star anise. So this is a fruit seed pod that hangs on a little bush. There would be a stem there when it was growing that it hangs from. And then these little individual fruits break open and the seed falls out. So the whole thing, pod, seeds and all, is used as a spice and as a medicine. And has an aromatic anise-like, licorice-like flavor to it. And it grows in South Asia and in the area in between South Asia and Australia, all the islands that are through there, somewhere in that area. So it has a variety of different medicinal properties. When, let's see, I think it was several years ago when there was some kind of a flu going around. It might have been H1N1 pandemic several years ago, but there was sort of a rumor or something like that that star anise could be considered an equivalent to Tamiflu. Tamiflu is a drug that is used for flu-like symptoms. The research on Tamiflu is not actually all that excellent. It's kind of like it works a little bit some of the time. It's not like its effectiveness is pretty modest. But because it was a familiar name and because it was what people would get if they went to their doctor with flu-like symptoms, it had good name recognition. And so because the substance in Tamiflu was, I think, originally supposed to have been derived from a substance in star anise, people kind of jumped to the conclusion or made the assumption that you could use star anise as an herbal equivalent of Tamiflu. But there isn't anything in star anise that is exactly all that similar to Tamiflu. However, like a lot of aromatic medicines, it will clear the airways and kind of decrease inflammation in the airways. And it will also make somebody sweat a little bit more profusely, which can cool you down if you have a fever. So it wasn't completely wrong that it would be useful in that type of situation, but not really any more useful than a lot of other herbs that are also aromatic, like say fennel or something like that, or regular old anise. Probably would have worked just about as well, or probably would work just about as well. Star anise does have some soothing effects on the nervous system as well, and on the endocrine system also. It increases the production of prolactin. So if somebody takes enough of it, it can increase milk supply if somebody's lactating. might even be able to induce lactation if it was taken in large enough amounts. But in general, it just kind of increases the amount of prolactin, which is the hormone produced in the pituitary, or protein that's produced in the pituitary, that sort of has a lot of signaling functions in the body. It not only increases milk supply, it also sometimes decreases sex drive a little bit. It tends to increase, let's see, it increases oxytocin, and oxytocin has been associated with like feelings of cuddliness, affection, empathy, things like that. I really hesitate to suggest or have anybody think that, you know, that those types of feelings can just be boiled down to oxytocin, because that's not all oxytocin does, and oxytocin by itself doesn't do those things. But prolactin can increase oxytocin sometimes, which can have an effect on menstrual cycles, all kinds of things. So it's kind of like just a very mild tonic for the reproductive system, a mild cooling tonic, one might say, for the reproductive system. It sort of maybe slows the reproductive system down a little bit, in a way, or calms it a little bit. So that's one use for it, and that's a subtle change. It's not like somebody's going to take it and it's going to totally, you know, rearrange their endocrine system or anything like that. It would be a mild change that would happen over time. But yeah, it is also, like I said, soothing to the airways, does produce sweating. It's also very soothing to the digestive system, and it's what Ayurvedic medicine might describe as a rasayana. So it helps fluids throughout the body to move a little more fluidly. So it's good for constipation. It's good for digestion. It's good for breathing, things like that. So it's a good sort of tonic herb, and it's kind of has a calming and uplifting effect for the nervous system, which in larger doses can be sort of almost like a mildly euphoric effect, the sort of thing where somebody might be more prone to laughter, and maybe more energized and restless and things like that as well. So so it can be used for elevating the mood, and along with other things, I've used it for helping with brain function, with mental function. Actually use it along with mugwort here, in people with age-related memory loss. And sometimes it's helpful for that, and sometimes it isn't. It's a complicated condition to work with, but sometimes it's very noticeably helpful for that. Would it help balance skin eruptions from hormone imbalance? Sometimes it will. It generally won't make them worse. It also is antifungal. So if somebody's taking this, it's going to have a mild antifungal effect that's going to come out through the skin, which, you know, a lot of the time I would use ferula asafoetida for that. But asafoetida is really a harsh tasting thing, and this is much more kid friendly. So if you have somebody with a tendency to develop things like ringworm or athlete's foot or something like that, which are mostly just kind of partly hygienic, but also partly constitutional. They show up in more with people with a damp or warm constitution, and are often childhood fungal infections of the skin, or, you know, not so much in little kids, but in a little bit older kids and teenagers. You see a lot of you know, fungal skin infections, and it's often something I will use in that situation, because it can be really hard to get a teenager to take something that tastes like brimstone, but something that tastes just sort of like black jelly beans or something like that is a little bit easier. Not as easy as one might hope, but often a fair bit easier. So yeah, that is not an herb that I have ever had a direct source for. And so that's why I use it less than I otherwise might. When I buy that, I kind of have to buy it through conventional channels because I don't have anybody to pick it for me where it grows. So I buy it through Frontier Co-op, and they're at least able to tell me where it was grown and where it came from and things like that, which is the minimum that I will accept before I will just say, okay, I can't use that herb. But it is something that is, yeah, not that I'm aware of possible to grow around here, and not something that I even have somebody in the areas where it does grow that I can reach out to and have them gather it for me. Although it might be, something that I might try to cultivate that relationship around eventually, because in more recent years with social media, it's a little easier to reach out to herb growers and gatherers in other places than what it used to be. It used to be that I had to rely upon chance meetings and things like that before I found those people, but now it's a lot easier to find them. So I've considered expanding my network of growers and gatherers and things like that. But yeah, the Elysium that I have, I bought, and so it's something that I tend to prefer other herbs just because of that, even though it's a perfectly good medicinal herb, and the stuff that I get seems to be high quality. I like the accountability and knowing where stuff came from with as much detail as possible before I use it. All right. Any questions on pedicularis or Elysium? Okay, so the question is, for topical pedicularis, is it used the same way with fleas, lice, bed bugs? Yeah, wash clothes with it to kill the organisms and their eggs. And it does seem to prevent and repel to some degree. Bed bugs are hard because they don't just get on clothes, they get in bedding and stuff like that, mattresses and stuff. But they sometimes get carried around in people's clothes and things like that. So yeah, it does seem to repel them and to kill them, and also to reduce the itchiness if you're using it topically as a wash. And so yeah, I use it either as an additive to the laundry in the form of putting it in a sachet in a bag or whatever, or else make an infusion of it and let that infusion cool and apply it to the skin for the actual itchiness. And if it was the hair, it would kind of be the same thing with both, just washing the hair and the scalp with it. With lice, I'm always not only going to wash the hair, scalp with whatever herbs I'm using, but also comb to physically remove any possible lice and nits, which is a painstaking process, but it's really hard to make sure they're gone without doing that. Could you make an oil with it for lice? I have never tried, but probably I suspect that would work, but I have not actually done it. You could definitely make an infusion in soapy water, and that will have some of the slippery properties of an oil while also having the water soluble stuff from the pedicularis in it. But I think that some of what is in it are organic acids, which are probably soluble in oil as well as water, but I'm not completely sure about that. Okay, so while we were on the walk this weekend, I talked some about doing the weekend intensive in April, and towards the end of April, basically not the last weekend in April, but the weekend before the last Tuesday in April, which I'll send out an email with the dates of that weekend for everybody. But I want to, I'm going to do it here at the clinic. Got some classroom type area, and I'll send the information out. And I'd like to have everybody who plans on physically being here to let me know, so I know how to, set things up for that. And I'll record the sessions as well. But I'm going to have a couple classes and an herb walk in a different area on the Saturday and the Sunday. Just a short herb walk. Probably one of them will be in a sort of semi-wetland area that's near here, and one of them will be somewhere else in town. And I want to do sort of a workshop with an introduction to cupping and moxa, where we're maybe doing some hands-on practice with that, as well as maybe talking a little bit about microscopy and how to use a microscope and things like that. Some additional things that I think would be helpful to you to have the ability to do that are harder to teach without it being hands-on. But I will record the sessions as well for those of you who are not able to come in person. And I hope that people can make it. I've gotten to see a bunch of your plant collections at this point, and I'm really loving looking at them. Good job, everybody that's shown me so far. I've really appreciated all the effort and care that's gone into it. And I know I've said this before, and that this might be kind of a hard thing to make yourself do, but I really sincerely encourage everybody to just keep adding to those, at least for another year or so, just as you encounter new plants and things like that. It will really help you to recognize the plants, because you're getting your hands on them, you're looking at them, you're pressing them, and then coming back and looking at them again when you're mounting them and everything like that. And it really, even though it might seem obsolete as a reference when there are so many other ones out there in modern times, it's really useful as a process and as a practice of getting to physically become more familiar with the plants. So I've really appreciated seeing those from everybody so far. And for those of you who are working on different projects, some of you have got some really good ones too. And I'm really appreciating seeing all of that and seeing the demonstrations of the skills that everyone is putting into those. All right. So any other questions today about either of the herbs we've talked about, or about the process of note taking, record keeping? All right. Well, thank you all for coming, and I will talk to you again pretty soon. And over the course of the next few days, I've been working on editing the footage from the weekend, so I will get that up soon, and I will send a message out when that is on the YouTube channel.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Talk to you soon.